Welcome to episode 2 of Bangkok Thought Leaders. I have the great honor of being here today at Shandwick, Thailand with Stuart Kelly, Managing Director of Shandwick, Thailand.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Thank you for being here. First of all, congratulations. Again, you've won PR Agency of the Year. What's your secret?
Yes, well, that's not all down to me or even Thailand. This was an award we won for the whole of Asia, where we have probably the biggest footprint of all of the international agencies. I believe this is the second time in 3 years that we've won this particular award. There are about 4 major awards companies that handle PR throughout the world, and so this was one. And if you look at our track record, I'm pleased to say over the last 10 years or so, we've won a great deal of the share of our awards.
Indeed.
Which is always very pleasing, obviously.
So, what is it about the work done by Shandwick that is so award-winning?
First and foremost, creativity. Now that might sound simple, but actually there's a lot more to it, because you have to consider the history of PR where it was. It was probably considered one of the more, I wouldn't like to use the word mundane, but certainly more traditional, perhaps something more staid, of the stable of agencies. So you typically get your market research agencies, you get your events companies, you get your advertising agencies, and obviously we're part of IPG Group, so there's some 50 odd brands that go under that, some of which are PR companies, some of which are advertising agencies. 10, 15 years ago, creativity tended to be jealously held, I suppose, by the advertising agencies who would win awards for creativity. And those were the days when I suppose television dominated, where you really needed that extra buzz, that extra spark. These days we have something called convergence, which I think maybe we should touch on a little bit later, because that's a topic in itself.
Sure.
But what it means is that PR is starting to move into that traditional territory. It's no longer simply about traditional media relations, it's about engaging audiences, and that means we need to be more creative as a type of industry more now. So, and I think Shandwick understood that perhaps faster than many of our competitors did, invested heavily. So we're investing in content producers or storytellers. We're no longer just investing in people with a very traditional PR agency background. We've got all sorts of people joining our business today because we know we need that creative spark.
And you're a great example of that. Like, obviously, I know your career a little bit. I followed you closely. A very storied career as a storyteller. You have done many different things, many wonderful things over the years, including being a journalist.
Yes, indeed.
Back in the day.
Indeed.
How has the storytelling experience changed over the years?
Well, quite a lot for PR people, and maybe it's best to use my personal definition of PR, which some of my colleagues are using as well, which is, people often say, well, what do you do when you're doing PR? What are you PRing? How do you do that? And I've always said, you're really doing one of two things. You're either starting a conversation or you're changing it. And so the whole idea of starting a conversation is where a client comes to you and says, I've got product A, or I've got brand awareness 0. How do I get that conversation started and going? And then when you're changing a conversation, that's something a little bit close to home for me, because I handle crisis communications. It's one of the things I do. And so that's when a client calls you up, typically at about 2 o'clock in the morning. You may never have heard of this client before, and they said, there's a conversation about my company or my product, there's a worm in my burger, please make it stop.
It's the mission impossible.
Mission impossible. And sometimes we say we can't stop that conversation, but we can redirect it, or we can change the conversation. Not limited typically to crisis communications. There's lots of ways you can change a conversation. When you're changing your brand, or you're refreshing your brand, you need to change that. And so PR became, I suppose, much better at that during this digital era, because when you're typically looking at an advertising company, they're trying to sell you a product, very consumer focused. Here's the 10 key advantages, buy the product, conversation over. In fact, there wasn't really a conversation, whereas PR people, we were natural storytellers. We had to engage our audiences in a two-way street in a conversation. So the world of digital, of course, is just tailor-made for that. And so that I think we've probably managed to steal a little bit of a march, if I can put it that way, on the advertising world, because we're naturally good at conversations.
I think that's a key point for PR agencies moving forward. Obviously, PR agencies were the dominant, or still are the dominant, advertising entity around the world.
Indeed,
with Ogilvy and McCann, obviously.
For sure, yeah.
Do you think that crisis communications is a particular niche that will probably never be taken away from those agencies because of the global.
Yeah, well, it fit naturally within the PR agency's world because, and a typical example of this, so many of us back in the day were journalists. And so in the days before social media or even the internet, many of us here can actually remember those days. I can. The media really was your first port of call for defending your story. So if a crisis broke, there was a bomb in the hotel lobby or an oil spill, your media, your traditional journalist was hopefully the person that you can engage and get your story out accurately, quickly, etc., etc. And so those skill sets came naturally to PR people. In fact, a lot of people today, lay people, tend to think of PR as crisis communications. That's the first thing they often think about. When they think about advertising, not so much. They think of a product on either a billboard or a television screen.
It's cure rather than prevention.
Yeah, no, exactly right. Yeah. So PR fit naturally within the crises world. Because of the fact that so many of us were journalists and we're used to handling crises in our own right because we like chasing ambulances by nature. So journalists are always looking for the bad news, not so much the good. And so when so many of us turned to this profession, we thought we knew how to handle journalists, I guess.
I think you're a very modest man, Stuart. Certainly with this topic, because I was fortunate enough to be invited with you to consult on a crisis communication issue
yes,
recently.
Indeed you were. Yes.
And the room was panicking, including me.
Yeah.
We have a problem, there's an issue. I was very nervous too, but you were by far the calmest person in the room.
That's my job, yes. Yes, indeed.
It's quite a specific skill set.
It is a specific skill set, and it's true to form for PR. I often laugh with the clients, and certainly during a crisis workshop where I'm training the group, I say, by the end of today, I'm going to be the only person in this room enjoying myself, and that's the way it should be, because you're meant to put them under pressure and panic them and alarm them, because that's the only way. It's a little bit like the army, isn't it? You've got to drill. And so it's true. It takes a special sort of person. But, I say it's true to form for PR across all of the types of services and offerings we do, because there's really two key skills for agency. Is we've got to be very good at PR. We do PR. That's why clients hire us. But we're also dealing with clients, and clients panic a lot.
Sure.
Even a simple publicity campaign around a product or a new phone, they're nervous Nellies at the best of times because so much can go wrong. That's not so true in what we call paid media, which is typically an advertising agency. There's a product, I'm paying for that space.
Control the narrative.
You can control the narrative, exactly right. With PR, it's what we call earned media. And so that's something where you're relying on independent authorities to hopefully speak good and hopefully not ill of the product, of your brand, of your company, or whatever it is. So there's always an element of risk. So typically when we're dealing with clients, there's a greater sense of nervousness, panic, perhaps risk inherent in what we do. But there's also great opportunity, because with those independent voices, in the old days it was the journalist, now it's a lot more online bloggers, influencers as we call them. There's still risk there as well, because these are people who have independent, strongly held opinions. But if they do see your side of the story, then of course there's a lot more credibility than a paid advertisement, isn't there? So there's risk, but there's also a great reward.
I think that's an excellent segue, actually, into the issue of convergence.
Yes, indeed.
So what does convergence mean?
It started, obviously convergence probably started happening as soon as the internet was developed, but you're hearing more and more about it in the last 10 years. In the last 5 years, it's been almost a settled argument. And what do I mean by that? Well, convergence is when we see, a large agency network such as IPG, which is our parent company, where we've got about 50 or 60 brands, something like that. Perhaps before the internet, each of those brands were unique. They did a job that I couldn't do, and Shandwick did a job that perhaps McCann couldn't do, who are around us today as our advertising affiliate. When the internet came along, it blurred the lines a lot, and people, for a period of about 10 to 15 years, and to some extent even today, weren't sure what to do about that. PR weren't sure who could handle social media. Was that best left to the advertising agencies, or was it best left to PR? I think going back to what I said about conversations and who's good inherently at conversations and telling stories, that's been PR. And so what you're seeing is Weber Shandwick gradually encroaching a lot more onto perhaps their territory than they've been encroaching on ours. So that battle, I should imagine, is largely being won by the PR agencies, and hence going back to the awards, why Weber Shandwick is winning awards today at the Cannes Awards, for example, that traditionally advertising agencies would win. Because we've brought in those elements of creativity to deal with this new online world of conversation. It's no longer the mundane conversation with the journalist, it's direct to the consumer or direct to the public in the case of the crises. That's a whole new realm of creativity that we have to bring to that challenge.
And when it comes to convergence, at Lexicon, we obviously...
Well, you're living and breathing it.
We indeed we are. For us, convergence is a slightly different thing. We're primarily focused on the storytelling, creative aspects. And so it's bringing together video production like this, as well as website design and everything else. There's probably a cozy relationship between the two, kind of global multinationals and the local agencies like us. How do you see that relationship?
Well, it's that nexus, isn't it, between, at what point does Lexicon become our competitor versus almost a friend that we can use each other. Right now we have a terrific relationship. And that's largely because we do the same thing. We're both storytellers inherently, and we've worked together on this together. We speak the same language. The difference is you have a unique set of tools, such as we're seeing around us today, and capabilities which we as Weber Shandwick might have globally as an agency, because we're just that big, we do, but we may choose not to focus on in a specific market like Thailand, which is one of our smaller markets in Asia. I mean, there's 30 people in my office, which is probably about the same size as Lexicon, I guess, but is probably our smallest office in Asia. So it means I naturally have to just stick to my knitting, so to speak, which is traditional media relations, plus a few other things like online outreach, bloggers, KOLs, influencers, that kind of thing, but largely for the big multinational clients who really need procurement to tick the box. They know that we're a safe pair of hands, they know we're a great brand, and typically they may work with Weber Shandwick in more than one market. So about 70% of my clients work with us all over. So there's a natural kind of relationship through the network. They're not expecting me here in Thailand to roll out the cameras and build web apps and websites and things, which you do. Okay, so you found the niche. Storytelling through your mediums and your forums, they don't compete with the kind of storytelling I do, even though we speak the same storytelling language. At what point do we end up competing? I don't think so. As long as you're operating in a market like Thailand, where Weber Shandwick will never say never, but that's not our chosen battlefield, so to speak. We're dealing with the big end of town.
The major corporations.
The major corporations and things like that.
Again, your humility shines through here, Stuart. 30 people locally, sure, but 10,000 globally, 20,000 globally.
There's some big numbers,
some experts on any topic from around the world whenever you need them. So.
Well, that's pretty. You've hit it on the head, really. It's that we tend, while we do compete locally. We have to. We compete locally on price. We compete for talent locally as well. There's many areas where we do compete with the smaller boutique firms. I think probably where we do win, and they win just as often as we do, but for different reasons. They may win because of that extraordinary localization that they can bring. Also, they can really hone in the type of product and service, such as Lexicon. You have capabilities we can't do, or we choose not to do in this market, because it's just not our bread and butter or our knitting. Where we do really come through big time for our clients, though, is that access to global expertise. Sure. Like, we really do have the world's best practice leading experts in all of the full array of services and offerings that make up PR, be it crises. We're talking about cybersecurity before we had this interview. We've got a massive cybersecurity crisis team in the US that I can access to at any time. So if there's a client with a particular problem or challenge that I personally don't feel confident about being able to get on top of quickly, invariably there's an expert somewhere in our global network of some 8,000 people, I think it is, who will. And they're a phone call or an email away. So.
Okay, I have another slightly off the wall question here. I'm always fascinated by the fact that there are many big PR agencies locally, but I never really see their names. Like I see you around town speaking at events. You're very public. You're in the newspapers a lot.
Yeah, I guess
a very
so.
public figure. How is it that PR agencies don't seem to be very good at PR?
We're a bit quiet.
Yes.
Yeah, it's an odd one, and it's a bit of a joke actually in the industry, because we're so good at telling our client stories that perhaps we're not so good at telling our own story sometimes, and maybe that's simply because we're too busy. But it is noticed, yes, and that's true, and that's not just in Thailand, by the way. I mean, that's fairly globally. I suppose I liken it a little bit to the world famous chef. You know, ex-Michelin stars to their name, and they go home and they make themselves a bacon butty, you know. So it's that sort of thing. You focus so much on your clients. But it's true, we don't do a particularly great job of PRing ourselves. I've started to do a lot more this year because I've had a bit more time to do more this year. And also we've seen some niche with crises communications, with me being part of the global team. Traditionally, Thailand's been very slow to embrace crisis communications. I think there's some cultural elements that go into that. Those are now being broken down, and especially because, as you know, and you know this, I mean, it's really is the social media capital of the world, and so they're becoming more cognizant of the risks and starting to approach us about these sort of things, where we got very few calls 5 years ago. Most of the work I did in crises, say 5 years ago, was really international.
So, Stuart, one final question. Yeah. Obviously, you've had a very storied career as a journalist, and you've seen the media evolve from print to digital and whatever comes next. What would be your prediction of the biggest changes we can expect over the next 5 to 10 years in the industry?
Yeah, good question, because as a former journalist, I think about that very thing a lot, and it's quite saddening to see, the degradation of journalism as a career, as an industry. There's a lot fewer journalists around. And then, of course, budgets are much smaller, so you're not seeing the depth of storytelling. And so that's, I think, is affecting their credibility. So that's the first thing that we're seeing. And the second is the rise of fake news or alternative news, etc. And that, of course, has come about through social media. That's really what's happened. And so I think we've got to that point where I really wonder, so we've seen this erosion of trust in journalists, which led to fake news, etc., and enormous influence on global affairs. You know, the US elections is well known, etc. The Arab Spring a few years ago as well was based on that. I wonder if we're not going to see a swing back to looking for sources of credibility once more, because the problem with the internet, while it's fantastic for information, there's such a deluge of information that who's to say what's fake and real anymore? Where is that independent journalist in the middle, that arbiter of independent view, saying, you know, that's really credible and that's useful information for you, and that's a load of nonsense, frankly. You don't need to see that, because that's what the journalist was doing. Without that journalist in the middle, perhaps they will see some kind of a comeback to that. Now, it may not be journalism in the form that we knew it, or PR in the form that we knew it, because they were really the tool that PR people would use to get our client story across. But there may well be a different form. There may be some other kind of independent organization or type of industry which understands what's happening with all this information and is saying, look, the human being still needs somebody to kind of deliver something, a package and it's going to be a lot more tailored than perhaps it was 20 years ago. That's more credible and is much more tailored to what they actually want to read. So I do think we're probably on the verge of seeing something now. We've had that first phase, which is the erosion of traditional journalism, which has affected our PR industry greatly. It's enormous, and we've struggled with that because every day we're seeing fewer and fewer journalists in the hope that they'll tell our client's story in a positive way. So who do we turn to? Well, we're turning to bloggers, but a lot of them are now being paid. Yes. So how credible are they? So that's the problem. So now we can't just purely go directly on social media, because how do you know if it's fake or if it's true, right? So PR, we're really looking for the voice of credibility. That's what we're doing. And where is that voice of credibility today? I think we're ambivalent about that, but I do think we have to find that voice of credibility. Will we see the return of journalism, or return of some form of journalism that is the new era of credibility? I don't know what's going to happen, but I think that's where we'll turn to, and in the next 10 years that question will be answered.
I think it's a great point. I would say that as as a world, as a society, as people. I think we're adolescents still when it comes to social media.
It's certainly, yeah.
We don't know what we're doing in many ways. Like the American election's a great example.
Yeah.
And there was fake news certainly, but I think also the journalistic model itself had started to collapse because of cuts in budgets and things like that. And even as far back as the 80s, people were talking about fake news, right? There was an inherent bias. We've opened up more voices now, but a lot of those voices are ridiculous.
Yeah.
So
and it's the outraged machine.
Exactly.
The keyboard warrior is the term that's come about. I'm encouraged though, Dave, because I think it was only yesterday I was on the airplane coming back and I was reading about. He's a kid really. He's fresh out of university and he's starting some kind of online forum for more rational debate. And he'd come up with a very interesting methodology for how that discourse will be carried out online. And he did it, and he's a young man, because he was recognizing that the quality of debate online was atrocious, frankly. And so if young people are already starting to recognize that and start adapting their behavior, and then you're getting people like this who are now creating a new type of forum, well, isn't that the new journalism that I was talking about before?
I think I might have read something similar yesterday. There's a new platform where you can only comment with 50
That's the
50
one.
characters.
I think it's the same guy. Yeah.
That's a great idea.
It's a really interesting idea. Now, that may or may not work right now, but I'm really encouraged that this new generation, millennials, are starting to think like that, because they really do need to come up with something interesting because, so far I think they've been part of this issue. We're always very quick to criticize them, aren't we? But I do think it's going to be their solution, and it's going to be one for them that they have to recognize.
Absolutely, because the people being born now, they're born in this world. That's their life.
Yeah, that's what it is. I mean, you think of, how I'm 50 this year. When I was growing up, we had no TV in the country I grew up in. I remember the advent of Atari. Then there was the internet came much later, and then social media. So we've seen a lot. Whereas my daughter, who's 16, has only known the internet. And so what the great evolution for her isn't technology. The technology is been fairly similar. It's been the evolution of the conversation and social discourse. That's a challenge for this generation. The challenge for us was just keeping up with the technology, right? I mean, I still remember using a typewriter as a cadet in a newsroom. Crushed beer cans strewn all over the carpet, pizza boxes on top of it. That was what it was like. And the newsroom today is a very quiet place. It was all tickety-tickety-tick. But in the old days, there were telephones going off. It was chaos, as a newsroom should be. So for us, it was trying to adapt to the huge leaps almost every year of technology. For my daughter, it's huge leaps in the evolution of our discourse. How do we conduct ourselves in order to carry on a civil society? Because that's what we're seeing is a breakdown.
Absolutely. I think we could be talking about this for the next 2 hours.
No, we could. I can tell already we're getting sidetracked.
I think this one might have to be at the pub. Finish this one.
I think so. I'll see you there in 10 minutes.
Or in part 2. So thank you so much for your time, Stuart. I know it's very valuable. Your time is very valuable. You're a busy man. I expect that people will see you and I probably presenting for OzCham again soon.
That would be great.
Hopefully a part 2 of this at some point. Stuart,
indeed. Thank you
so much.
Good day. Cheers.
You.